Arthur Pendleton was a 68-year-old retired chief financial officer. But to his only son, Bradley, he was just a simple, pathetic old man, a burden weighing down his future. Bradley and his flashy new in-laws certainly thought so. Arthur found this out the hard way when he returned home a day early from a quiet fishing trip. He found his gentle wife, Eleanor, crying all alone on the front porch of their humble Boston home. But from inside the house, he could hear his son laughing. Bradley was laughing loudly with his in-laws and a real estate agent as they toured the rooms, plotting to lock Arthur and Eleanor away in a cheap nursing home just to sell the property. They thought Arthur was finished. They thought he was powerless. They didn't know that the fragile man in the frayed sweater they were trying to throw away was secretly sitting on a $40 million financial empire. And they didn't know that he had already set the trap for them. Arthur stood perfectly still on the worn wooden planks of the porch. The crisp autumn air bit at his cheeks, but he barely registered the cold. His tackle box slipped from his grip and hit the floorboards with a soft thud. Eleanor sat curled on the old wicker bench with her face buried in her trembling hands. She was a woman who had spent 40 years building a life of quiet dignity and boundless love for her family. Now she was weeping with a profound sorrow that tore at Arthur from the inside out. He knelt slowly beside her and enveloped her shaking shoulders in his thick wool sweater. Arthur had spent his entire career in boardrooms surrounded by ruthless men who smiled while cutting throats. He had built his fortune by reading the hidden intentions of people who thought they were smarter than him. He had always feared that Bradley possessed a weak character that would easily succumb to the allure of easy money. That was exactly why Arthur had chosen to hide his massive wealth and raise the boy in an environment of strict frugality and hard work. He wanted to forge a man of substance, but listening to the vile conversation inside proved his experiment had failed miserably. His son had merely learned to hide his deep resentment behind a fragile mask of dutiful obedience. Now intoxicated by the fake prestige of the Vance family, Bradley had finally revealed his true and treacherous nature. Through the half-open living room window, the voices of their betrayers drifted out into the fading evening light. Sterling Vance possessed a loud and booming voice that carried the obnoxious confidence of a man accustomed to bullying his way through life. Sterling was currently admiring the oak beams of the ceiling and calculating the exact profit margin of tearing them down. Victoria Vance chimed in with her shrill and aristocratic tone, complaining about the outdated kitchen cabinets and the lingering smell of cheap pine cleaner. They spoke of the house not as a loving home containing decades of memories, but as a decaying carcass ready to be picked clean. Chloe, the wife Bradley had chosen over his own blood, added that she could not wait to clear out the pathetic thrift store furniture. Every word they spoke was a deliberate insult aimed at erasing the humble legacy Arthur had carefully constructed for his family. Then came the voice that finally solidified the heavy ice in Arthur's chest. Bradley, the boy Arthur had taught to ride a bicycle on this very driveway, was eagerly agreeing with his parents-in-law. Bradley complained loudly that he was absolutely exhausted from managing his elderly parents and their pathetic finances. He assured the real estate agent that the paperwork for a minimum care facility was already being drafted and the property would be vacated within a single week. Bradley laughed again, a shallow and greedy sound that echoed off the wooden walls and twisted the knife deeper into Eleanor's back. She whimpered against Arthur's chest and begged him softly to tell her it was just a terrible nightmare. Arthur stroked her hair and promised her quietly that everything was going to be perfectly fine. Any ordinary man would have kicked the front door open and unleashed a storm of furious rage upon the intruders. Arthur felt that primal anger rising in his throat like burning acid, but he expertly swallowed it down. He was a master of financial warfare and a veteran of corporate takeovers who knew that screaming only surrendered the critical element of surprise. He looked through the glass pane of the door and watched his son clinking a glass of his own vintage whiskey with Sterling Vance. They were raising a toast to their stolen future and the impending exile of the people who had given Bradley everything. Arthur did not see a beloved son in that room anymore. He only saw a toxic liability that needed to be aggressively liquidated. He nodded slowly to himself as a terrifying clarity washed over his mind and completely erased all his remaining paternal instincts. He pressed a gentle kiss to Eleanor's silver hair and helped her stand up on her unsteady feet. He did not let her look back through the window at the people dividing their sanctuary like spoils of war. Arthur guided his weeping wife down the porch steps and across the damp autumn grass toward the borrowed sedan parked silently by the curb. He opened the passenger door and settled her inside, making sure the heater was turned on high to warm her shivering frame. He promised her one more time that absolute justice would be served before the week was over. Arthur walked around to the driver's side and took one final look at the brightly lit wooden house that had sheltered them for decades. He turned the ignition key and the engine purred to life, carrying them away into the darkness while the vultures inside continued to feast on their pathetic illusions. The borrowed sedan pulled up to the glittering entrance of the Ritz-Carlton in downtown Boston. Eleanor shrank back into the worn upholstery as a uniformed valet opened her door. She whispered frantically to Arthur that they did not belong in a place like this and that they could not afford even a cup of coffee inside. Arthur merely smiled a gentle and reassuring smile as he handed the keys to the young valet. When they stepped into the grand marble lobby dripping with crystal chandeliers, the night manager immediately rushed forward. The manager did not look at their frayed clothes but bowed his head respectfully and welcomed Mr. Pendleton back, stating that the presidential suite had been prepared exactly as requested. Eleanor stared at her husband in absolute bewilderment as they were escorted to the private elevator. The brass doors opened to a sprawling penthouse that was larger than their entire wooden house in the suburbs. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the Boston skyline glittering against the dark night sky. Eleanor stood frozen on the threshold of the magnificent living room, afraid to step onto the plush Persian rug in her scuffed shoes. She grabbed Arthur by his sleeve and her voice trembled with genuine terror as she begged him to explain what was happening. She reminded him that their joint savings account barely had enough to cover the winter heating bill, let alone a luxury suite that surely cost thousands of dollars a night. She wept that Bradley was trying to take their home and now Arthur was carelessly throwing away whatever pathetic safety net they had left. Arthur gently removed his worn wool sweater and draped it over a velvet armchair before taking his wife by the hands. He led her to a massive silk sofa and sat her down, looking deeply into her tearful eyes. He spoke with a steady and calming cadence that he had not used since his days dominating corporate boardrooms. He told her that he had kept a massive secret for decades to protect their family, but tonight the time for hiding had finally come to an end. He confessed that he was not just a retired accountant scraping by on a meager pension and monthly Social Security checks. He explained that before he retired he had engineered a series of brilliant corporate acquisitions and structured a massive financial holding company. Eleanor listened in stunned silence as Arthur carefully laid out the exact truth of their hidden reality. He revealed that the Pendleton Family Trust was not a small emergency fund but a vast empire of diversified investments and offshore accounts. He watched her breath catch in her throat when he calmly stated that the trust currently held liquid assets exceeding $40 million. She shook her head in sheer disbelief, asking him repeatedly why they had lived with leaking roofs and coupon clippings if they possessed such astronomical wealth. Arthur felt a heavy ache in his chest as he explained the painful logic behind his lifelong deception. He told her that he had seen how inherited fortunes destroyed the children of his wealthy colleagues, turning them into weak and entitled parasites. Arthur confessed that he wanted Bradley to learn the true value of a dollar earned through honest labor and perseverance. He thought that by projecting an image of working-class struggles he could forge a son who was humble, grateful, and resilient. But as he looked at Eleanor breaking down on the silk cushions, he admitted his profound failure. The manufactured poverty had not taught Bradley character, it had only bred a deep and venomous resentment toward his own parents. By pretending to be weak and financially vulnerable, Arthur had unwittingly provided the perfect test to expose Bradley's true nature. And their son had failed that test in the most spectacular and devastating way imaginable, choosing to align with the fraudulent Vance family to cannibalize the people who gave him life. Eleanor processed the overwhelming revelation as the tears slowly dried on her weathered cheeks. The shock of the $40 million began to recede, replaced by a cold and piercing understanding of what had transpired on their porch. The boys she had nurtured and loved had not just disrespected them, he had actively conspired to lock them in a miserable facility over a few $100,000 of perceived real estate value. She looked around the opulent suite and then looked back at the husband she thought she knew perfectly. She did not express anger at the decades of deception. Instead, she asked him in a voice hardened by maternal heartbreak what they were going to do next. Arthur felt a dark and absolute resolve settle over him as he promised her that tomorrow they would teach their greedy son exactly what a hostile takeover looked like. The ornate grandfather clock in the corner of the penthouse living room chimed softly to announce the arrival of midnight. Eleanor had finally succumbed to her exhaustion and was sleeping deeply in the master bedroom under a mountain of expensive silk sheets. Arthur remained fully awake and stood alone by the massive windows overlooking the sleeping city of Boston. The glowing lights of the financial district mirrored the cold and calculated energy that was currently surging through his veins. He reached into the pocket of his worn trousers and pulled out his cell phone to make the most consequential call of his entire life. He dialed a private number that he knew by heart and waited as it rang in a highly secure brownstone across town. The man who answered the phone after the second ring was Harrison, a legal titan who managed the affairs of the most powerful families on the East Coast. Harrison did not sound groggy or surprised because he knew Arthur Pendleton only called at this hour if the sky was actively falling. Arthur spoke in a low and steady voice as he recounted the exact events that had transpired on his front porch earlier that evening. He detailed the vile conversation between his son and the Vance family regarding the cheap nursing home and the impending sale of the wooden house. A heavy and dangerous silence hung on the line as the formidable lawyer absorbed the sheer audacity of the betrayal. Harrison finally spoke, his voice dripping with a refined but lethal professional anger on behalf of his oldest client and friend. Arthur did not waste time dwelling on his paternal grief and immediately issued a direct order to his trusted lawyer. He instructed Harrison to immediately activate the nuclear clause hidden deep within the foundational documents of the Pendleton Family Trust. Harrison let out a slow breath and felt obligated to remind Arthur of the absolute finality of this specific legal maneuver. The lawyer explained that once this clause was triggered, it would irrevocably and permanently disinherit Bradley from the $40 million fortune. There would be no avenues for appeal and no future amendments allowed, rendering their only son a complete legal ghost to the estate. Arthur did not hesitate for a single second as he confirmed the order, stating that the boy he raised was already dead and only a greedy parasite remained. With the destruction of his son legally secured, Arthur turned his tactical focus toward the flashy and arrogant Vance family. He told Harrison that he needed to understand exactly why a family boasting about high society connections was so desperately eager to steal a modest suburban home. Arthur ordered the lawyer to unleash his elite team of forensic accountants and private investigators the moment the sun came up. He wanted every bank account, every credit card statement, and every hidden liability attached to Sterling and Victoria Vance thoroughly dissected. He wanted to know exactly what kind of financial rot Chloe and her parents were hiding behind their expensive designer clothing and leased luxury vehicles. Harrison promised that his team would tear through their financial histories like a hurricane and have a comprehensive dossier ready by morning. Harrison then asked his client how they should handle the impending confrontation with the treacherous family. Arthur explained his plan to use his son's twisted perception of reality as the ultimate weapon against him. He would call Bradley the next day and perform the role of a terrified and senile old man who was completely surrendering to their cruel demands. Arthur requested that Harrison prepare a very specific set of documents disguised as a standard transfer of property and care agreement. The lawyer instantly understood the brilliant strategy and agreed to draft a contract containing a hidden confession of elder abuse and fraud. They finalized the details of the trap, ensuring the executive boardroom would be perfectly staged to welcome the arrogant thieves. Arthur ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket, feeling the immense gravity of the machinery he had just set into motion. The trap was now fully armed and merely waiting for the greedy victims to step blindly onto the lethal trigger. He looked down at his own calloused hands and felt a profound sadness mix with his unyielding demand for absolute justice. He had spent his entire life building a legacy to protect his family, but now he had to weaponize that same legacy to destroy his own flesh and blood. He walked quietly back into the bedroom to watch his gentle wife sleep, silently vowing that no one would ever make her shed another tear. Tomorrow, the predators who thought they had cornered a weak old man would meet the ruthless architect of their total ruin. The morning sun pierced through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of Harrison Elite Law Firm located on the 45th floor of the financial tower. Arthur and Eleanor stepped out of the private elevator wearing the same humble clothes from the night before, but their demeanor had entirely shifted. Eleanor walked with a new firmness in her step while Arthur carried the cold and calculating aura of a corporate titan preparing for a hostile acquisition. Harrison greeted them with a solemn nod and immediately ushered them into the expansive mahogany boardroom. The massive table was empty except for a thick black folder resting precisely in the center. Harrison took his seat at the head of the table and folded his hands, his expression grim as he prepared to deliver the forensic autopsy of the Vance family. Arthur pulled out a plush leather chair for Eleanor before taking his own seat. He looked at the black folder and instructed Harrison to present the findings without any sugarcoating or gentle phrasing. The lawyer opened the file and explained that his elite team of investigators and forensic accountants had worked through the entire night pulling every available financial record connected to Sterling, Victoria, Chloe, and Bradley. What they found beneath the carefully curated social media posts and leased luxury vehicles was a spectacular and terrifying abyss of financial ruin. Harrison stated clearly that the Vance family was not wealthy by any metric, but rather they were entirely insolvent and actively drowning in a sea of toxic liabilities. Harrison clicked a small remote and a large projection screen descended silently from the ceiling, displaying a complex web of red ink and overwhelming deficits. He pointed the laser pointer to the final compiled figure at the bottom of the spreadsheet and the words hit the room like a physical blow. Between maxed-out credit cards, defaulted personal loans, and desperate payday advances, Bradley and his flashy in-laws were currently carrying over $800,000 in unsecured high-interest debt. Eleanor gasped softly and covered her mouth as she stared at the staggering number illuminating the dark room. She could not comprehend how a young couple and their supposed high society parents could possibly burn through nearly $1 million of phantom money without anyone noticing the collapse. The lawyer mercilessly dissected the source of the immense financial hemorrhage. He brought up slides showing Chloe's obsessive purchasing of designer handbags, exotic vacations charged to multiple accounts, and luxury cars leased under completely fraudulent income statements. Bradley, desperate to maintain the illusion and keep his demanding wife satisfied, had secretly taken out predatory loans and even drained his own modest retirement funds. But the most damning evidence centered entirely on Sterling Vance and his fake empire. Harrison revealed that Sterling boutique investment firm was a complete sham currently under active investigation by federal authorities for gross embezzlement. Sterling had been quietly siphoning money from his own clients to fund his wife Victoria's lavish lifestyle and keep the illusion of generational wealth alive. The horrific truth of their midnight conversation on the porch finally crystallized into sharp and undeniable focus for Arthur. He leaned forward as the pieces of the puzzle locked together with sickening clarity. Bradley and the Vance family did not want to put Arthur and Eleanor in a nursing home simply because they were an inconvenience or a social embarrassment. They were doing it out of pure, unadulterated desperation to save their own skins. Harrison confirmed that the banks were preparing to foreclose on the Vance family properties and federal indictments were looming just weeks away. The modest suburban wooden house owned by Arthur was the only tangible, unencumbered asset they thought they could easily liquidate to survive. They intended to declare Arthur legally incompetent, seize the property, sell it for a quick few $100,000, and use the cash to temporarily stall their creditors and keep Sterling out of a federal penitentiary. Eleanor stared at the screen as her last remaining shred of maternal denial completely evaporated into the cold air. Her son had not just made a few poor financial decisions, he had actively conspired to sacrifice his parents' survival to pay for a life built entirely on lies. The profound sadness that had consumed her the previous night rapidly hardened into a cold and unyielding armor. She turned to Arthur, her eyes dry and burning with a fierce protective fire, and stated quietly that they could not let Bradley and his monsters get away with this betrayal. Arthur placed his hand over hers and felt a deep surge of pride for the resilient woman he had married. He looked back at Harrison and ordered him to finalize the trap immediately without showing any mercy. Knowing exactly how desperate the vultures were, Arthur realized they would blindly sprint toward any glimmer of financial salvation without checking for hidden wires. He told Harrison that the bait must be presented perfectly today while their panic was at its absolute peak. The lawyer nodded and tapped the secondary file on the table, confirming that the fraudulent transfer and care agreement was fully drafted and ready for signatures. Arthur stood up from the heavy leather chair and pulled his phone from his pocket, preparing to make the call that would lure his treacherous son directly into the slaughterhouse. Arthur stood by the expansive glass window of the boardroom and looked down at the bustling city far below. He took a slow and deliberate breath to clear his mind before dialing the number of his only son. Eleanor sat rigidly in her leather chair while Harrison watched with the quiet intensity of a predator waiting for the hunt to begin. The phone rang 3 times before Bradley finally answered with a clipped and impatient tone. Arthur immediately dropped his shoulders and allowed a manufactured tremor to infect his voice. He transformed himself into the exact pathetic creature that his son and the Vance family believed him to be. Arthur spoke softly, letting his words crack with feigned exhaustion and profound defeat. He told Bradley that he and Eleanor had spent the entire night crying and talking about their rapidly deteriorating situation. He confessed that his memory was failing him lately and the maintenance of the old suburban house had become an impossible burden for them to carry. Playing his part to absolute perfection, Arthur whispered that he finally understood he was no longer capable of making sound decisions for his own future. He told his son that he surrendered to the reality of their old age and agreed that moving into a managed care facility was the only logical step left. Bradley remained silent for a long moment, completely stunned by the sudden and total capitulation of his stubborn father. Arthur did not let the silence linger and immediately cast the lethal hook into the dark water. He told Bradley that he wanted to legally sign over the deed to the suburban property and grant him full authority over their assets before his mental state worsened. Arthur insisted that they needed to finalize the paperwork today so the house could be sold quickly to cover the rising medical costs. He instructed his son to gather Chloe and her parents and bring them to a specialized law office downtown that afternoon. Arthur explained that having the Vance family present as official witnesses would ensure no one could ever contest the transfer of power. The sheer greed radiating through the phone speaker was almost palpable as Bradley eagerly swallowed the deadly bait. His voice pitched up with poorly concealed triumph as he praised his father for finally being reasonable and doing the right thing for the family. The treacherous son promised that he would handle all the difficult details and assured Arthur that he and Eleanor would be taken care of in a very practical facility. Bradley confirmed that he would bring Chloe and her parents to the specified address at exactly 2 in the afternoon to sign every necessary document. Arthur thanked his son with a pathetic whimper, playing the broken victim right up until the final second. Arthur ended the call and placed the phone gently on the polished mahogany table. The frail and trembling old man vanished instantly, replaced once again by the ruthless architect of justice. He looked across the boardroom at Eleanor, whose eyes were filled with a mixture of immense sorrow and hardened resolve. Harrison closed the thick black folder and gave a brief nod of professional approval at the flawless execution of the psychological trap. The stage was now perfectly set for the greatest financial slaughter of his long and legendary career. All they had to do now was wait for the arrogant thieves to walk blindly into the execution chamber. Exactly at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy glass doors of the executive boardroom swung open. Bradley led the procession with his chest puffed out, wearing a tailored navy suit that he certainly could not afford on his actual salary. Chloe followed closely behind him, draped in aggressive designer labels and carrying a leather handbag that cost more than a reliable used car. Sterling and Victoria Vance brought up the rear, oozing a toxic combination of unearned confidence and desperate arrogance. They walked into the pristine legal sanctuary not as guests but as conquering royalty arriving to collect their expected tribute. They did not even glance at the magnificent skyline view because they were entirely focused on the frail-looking couple sitting at the far end of the massive mahogany table. Sterling Vance immediately claimed a high-backed leather chair and unbuttoned his expensive jacket with a theatrical sigh. He offered Arthur a condescending smile that resembled a shark baring its teeth right before a meal. Victoria glided over to Eleanor and placed a heavily manicured hand on the older woman's shoulder, dripping with a sickeningly sweet tone of fake sympathy. The matriarch of the Vance family whispered loudly that this transition was for the absolute best and that the elderly needed to accept when their time for independence had finally passed. Eleanor kept her eyes fixed firmly on the polished wood of the table, clutching her purse tightly to stop her hands from trembling with raw fury. Arthur watched the despicable performance with dull and vacant eyes, fully committing to the illusion of a defeated patriarch who had completely surrendered his dignity. Chloe impatiently checked the diamond-encrusted watch on her wrist and let out a loud and dramatic exhale. She reminded everyone in the room that they had secured reservations at a highly exclusive 5-star French restaurant at exactly 5 o'clock, and they simply could not afford to be late. Bradley nodded in agreement and leaned across the table toward his father, dropping any remaining pretense of genuine familial concern. He spoke to Arthur as if he were addressing a slow and burdensome child, instructing him to just get the paperwork over with so they could all move on with their lives. The son insisted that the chosen care facility had a hard deadline for the initial deposit and the suburban house needed to be listed on the market by tomorrow morning. He demanded that the lawyer present the documents immediately so they could finalize the necessary transfer of authority without any further annoying delays. Harrison sat perfectly still at the head of the table, observing the entire spectacle with the detached fascination of a scientist examining a highly infectious bacteria. The elite attorney wore an impeccable charcoal suit that projected absolute authority, but he deliberately softened his voice to play the role of a compliant clerk. He addressed the arrogant group with a polite nod, confirming that all the required legal instruments had been prepared exactly according to the instructions provided by Mr. Pendleton. Harrison reached out and pulled the thick black folder toward him, his manicured fingers resting lightly on the pristine cover. He looked directly at Sterling Vance and politely thanked the family for taking the time to act as official witnesses for such a delicate and tragic family transition. The lawyer spoke with a perfectly neutral tone, ensuring the greedy vultures felt completely safe and unchallenged as they settled into the execution chamber. Harrison reached into the thick black folder and extracted 4 heavy stacks of legal documents printed on premium bond paper. He slid a copy across the polished mahogany table to Bradley and pushed another towards Sterling Vance. Harrison explained in a smooth and highly practiced tone that this was the comprehensive care and property transfer agreement they had requested. He told the eager group that the contract dictated the total surrender of the suburban property deed to Bradley Pendleton. He added that in exchange for this immense financial gift, the younger couple legally assumed all responsibility for the future housing and medical supervision of Arthur and Eleanor. Chloe practically vibrated with excitement in her plush leather chair the moment she heard the word deed spoken aloud. Bradley barely nodded as he aggressively clicked an expensive fountain pen and immediately flipped toward the final pages of the document. None of the arrogant predators sitting at the table bothered to read the dense paragraphs of legal text filling the preceding pages. If they had bothered to scan Section 4, they would have discovered a highly irregular and exceptionally dangerous series of clauses. Harrison had expertly drafted a section requiring the primary beneficiary and all official witnesses to swear under penalty of perjury that Arthur Pendleton was currently suffering from severe cognitive decline. The hidden text explicitly stated that Arthur was entirely incapable of making rational financial or personal decisions due to advanced mental incompetence. By signing the document, they were not just accepting a house, but actively submitting a notarized confession that they were taking control of an incapacitated man against his will. But the reservation at the French restaurant was waiting, and the illusion of a quick payday completely blinded them to the lethal snare resting right under their manicured hands. Harrison gently interrupted Bradley before the pen could touch the signature line, insisting that proper legal protocol must be followed to ensure the transfer was absolutely ironclad. The lawyer turned his polite attention to Sterling and Victoria Vance, requesting that they sign page 8 first to act as the official sworn witnesses. He explained that their signatures merely attested to their presence during the family discussion and confirmed their unified belief that Arthur required immediate dedicated supervision. Sterling let out a booming laugh that echoed off the glass walls, loudly declaring that anyone with eyes could see the old man had lost his mind years ago. Victoria chuckled along with her husband and eagerly snatched a silver pen from the center console. The two fraudsters leaned over the mahogany table and proudly signed their names in flowing cursive, legally documenting their participation in a conspiracy to commit elder fraud. With the witness attestation securely executed, Harrison slid the primary signature page back in front of Bradley and Chloe. He advised them softly that their signatures would finalize the total transfer of authority and irrevocably bind them to the specific conditions outlined in the agreement. Chloe did not hesitate for a fraction of a second, hastily scribbling her name with a triumphant smirk plastered across her heavily contoured face. Bradley looked at the designated line and briefly glanced up at his father sitting quietly at the far end of the table. Arthur kept his head bowed and allowed his hands to tremble slightly, playing the broken victim to ensure the final nail was driven deep into the coffin. Whatever microscopic shred of conscience Bradley might have possessed was instantly extinguished by his overwhelming greed, and he pressed the pen firmly to the paper. His signature completed the betrayal, officially severing his soul from the parents who had sacrificed everything to raise him. Harrison calmly collected the 4 signed documents and tapped the heavy stack neatly against the polished wood of the table. The sharp clicking sound of the paper aligning seemed to suck all the remaining air out of the executive boardroom. Chloe clapped her hands together and loudly announced that they should celebrate with expensive champagne before heading to their exclusive dinner reservation. Bradley let out a long exhale of pure relief, believing the crushing weight of his massive debt had just been lifted from his shoulders. But the celebration died in their throats when they suddenly realized that the frail and trembling old man at the end of the table was no longer shaking. Arthur slowly straightened his spine and raised his head, erasing every trace of weakness from his posture in a single terrifying motion. The dull and vacant expression vanished from his face, replaced by a gaze so cold and piercing that the temperature in the room seemed to instantly drop to freezing. Arthur placed his hands flat on the mahogany surface, and the absolute stillness of his body radiated an overwhelming and predatory authority. He looked directly into the eyes of his son, and Bradley felt an involuntary shiver run down his spine as the familiar illusion of the pathetic old man shattered into a million pieces. Victoria Vance stopped fixing her lipstick, and Sterling slowly lowered his hands from his chest, suddenly sensing that an invisible steel door had just slammed shut behind them. Eleanor sat perfectly upright next to her husband, her tears completely dried up and replaced by the unyielding strength of a matriarch witnessing a long overdue execution. Arthur did not scream or raise his voice to demand their attention, because true power only required a whisper to command absolute silence. He turned his head slightly toward the head of the table and gave the brilliant lawyer a single decisive nod. The heavy silence in the boardroom was finally broken by the scraping of wooden chair legs against the floor. Chloe grabbed her expensive handbag and attempted to stand up, nervously trying to ignore the terrifying transformation of the man sitting at the end of the table. She forced a rigid smile and told Bradley they needed to leave immediately to make their dinner reservations on time. Bradley moved to follow her, but his legs felt strangely heavy as he stared at the cold and imposing figure of his father. Harrison raised a single manicured hand, and the simple gesture carried enough authority to freeze the younger couple right in their tracks. The lawyer informed them in a dangerously smooth voice that they were not permitted to leave just yet. He stated that there was a minor technical discrepancy regarding the property transfer they had all just so eagerly executed. Sterling Vance aggressively buttoned his suit jacket and leaned forward with a deep scowl of profound irritation. He demanded to know what kind of clerical error could possibly delay them, asserting that a simple house deed transfer was basic legal protocol. He boasted loudly about his own extensive experience with property acquisitions and insisted the signatures they provided were more than sufficient. Harrison offered a polite but completely humorless smile that did not reach his sharp eyes. The attorney explained with surgical precision that the fundamental issue was not with their signatures but with the actual ownership of the property itself. Harrison looked directly at Bradley and stated that Arthur Pendleton could not legally transfer the deed to the suburban wooden house because Arthur Pendleton did not personally own it. A wave of profound confusion washed over the arrogant faces of the predators sitting around the mahogany table. Bradley blinked rapidly and stammered, asking his father what the lawyer was talking about since they had lived in that exact house for his entire life. Harrison did not allow Arthur to answer and seamlessly took control of the narrative with his commanding presence. The lawyer clarified that the undisputed legal owner of the property for the last 30 years was an entity known as the Pendleton Family Trust. Victoria Vance let out a shrill and highly condescending laugh that pierced the tense atmosphere of the boardroom. She mocked the very concept of an impoverished retired accountant holding a trust fund, sneering that it probably contained a few $1,000s and a worthless life insurance policy. She demanded that they stop wasting time on pathetic middle-class financial illusions. Arthur finally spoke, his voice completely devoid of the pathetic tremors he had manufactured just moments before. His tone was deep, resonant, and carried the undeniable weight of a man who had built empires and crushed rivals. He did not look at the mocking woman but kept his steely gaze firmly locked on his trembling son. Arthur quietly instructed his lawyer to read the current and official valuation of the trust for the benefit of their impatient guests. Harrison smoothly closed the black folder and opened a pristine white ledger that had been resting unnoticed near his elbow. The attorney adjusted his glasses and announced that as of the market opening this morning, the trust held liquid and fixed assets totaling exactly $40 million. The absolute silence that followed the announcement was so profound that the faint hum of the building ventilation system sounded like a roaring engine. Sterling Vance lost all the color in his face, his smug expression dissolving into a mask of pure and unadulterated shock. Victoria dropped her silver pen, the metal clattering loudly against the polished wood as her mouth fell completely open. Bradley sat entirely paralyzed in his leather chair, his mind desperately trying to comprehend the astronomical figure that defied his entire reality. He had spent his whole life being deeply ashamed of his frugal parents, never suspecting that the man in the frayed sweater could buy and sell the flashy Vance family 100 times over. But the most spectacular and repulsive reaction belonged entirely to his wife. Chloe processed the monumental revelation and went through a rapid sequence of emotions that culminated in a wild and ecstatic frenzy. The utter contempt she had shown the elderly couple vanished instantly, replaced by a desperate and clawing adoration fueled by boundless greed. She practically launched herself out of her chair and rushed toward Arthur, her voice pitching into a hysterical squeal of absolute delight. She praised Arthur as a brilliant genius, claiming she always knew he was a fiercely distinguished man playing a clever game. Chloe turned to Bradley with wide and crazed eyes, shrieking that they were completely rich and no longer had to worry about their crushing debts. She reached out to grasp Arthur by the shoulder, but her manicured fingers met nothing but the icy and immovable stare of a father preparing to deliver his final judgment. Arthur did not flinch as Chloe reached out her greedy hands toward him. He simply raised his right arm and batted her away with a swift and entirely dismissive motion. Chloe stumbled backward on her expensive heels, her ecstatic smile instantly crumbling into a mask of pure confusion. Arthur looked at the woman his son had chosen and felt absolutely nothing but a profound and overwhelming disgust. He told her in a voice as cold as absolute zero that she was celebrating a victory that simply did not exist. He shifted his piercing gaze back to his paralyzed son and stated clearly that there was no fortune waiting for them. The opulent dream they had constructed in their minds was about to be aggressively and permanently demolished. Sterling Vance slammed his fist on the mahogany table and demanded to know what Arthur was talking about. The fraudulent patriarch insisted that a signed legal contract was absolute and the transfer of property must be honored immediately. Harrison picked up the thick stack of signed papers and offered Sterling a smile completely devoid of any professional courtesy. The elite attorney agreed that the document was indeed a legally binding instrument of immense and undeniable power. However, Harrison clarified that the papers held absolutely zero value as a real estate transfer because the grantor lacked the legal authority to surrender the deed. The lawyer tapped the heavy stack against the table and announced that the document was actually a fully notarized confession. He stated that the four of them had just willingly documented their active participation in a conspiracy to commit elder fraud. Victoria Vance let out a sharp gasp and instinctively reached for her silver pen as if she could somehow erase her signature. Harrison ignored her panic and calmly read the hidden clauses aloud for the entire boardroom to hear. He highlighted the specific paragraphs where the witnesses and beneficiaries swore under penalty of perjury that Arthur was suffering from severe cognitive decline. By providing their signatures, the greedy group had legally admitted to plotting a hostile takeover of an incapacitated victim. The lawyer pointed out that trying to seize assets under the false pretense of medical incompetence was a severe criminal offense. Bradley finally found his voice and stammered that it was just a misunderstanding regarding a simple suburban house. He desperately argued that even if the house transfer was void, he was still the primary heir to the entire $40 million estate. Arthur leaned forward and rested his calloused hands on the polished table, preparing to deliver the lethal blow he had promised his wife. He told his son that the family trust was not just a massive vault of money but a highly fortified legal fortress. He explained that decades ago he had anticipated the exact possibility of a greedy heir attempting to betray the family. To prevent such a disaster, he had instructed Harrison to embed a highly specialized defensive mechanism deep within the foundational bylaws of the trust. This security measure was known internally as the poison pill, and it was designed to instantly neutralize any internal threats. Arthur stared into the terrified eyes of his only child and stated that the defensive protocol had remained completely dormant for 30 years. He whispered with devastating finality that the trap only activated when a beneficiary attempted to harm the very people who gave them life. Harrison smoothly took over the presentation to formally execute the legal destruction of the treacherous son. The attorney explained that the defensive clause mandated the immediate and permanent disinheritance of any beneficiary who committed financial or emotional abuse against the founders. He stated that plotting to lock Arthur in a facility and signing a fraudulent declaration of incompetence overwhelmingly satisfied those specific conditions. Harrison looked directly at Bradley and delivered the ultimate verdict with a voice sharp enough to cut through solid steel. The lawyer declared that the exact moment Bradley signed his name on that final page, he irrevocably triggered his own financial execution. Bradley Pendleton was officially and permanently erased from the trust documents as if he had never existed in the first place. The treacherous son would not receive a single penny of the $40 million he had just sacrificed his soul to steal. The absolute finality of Harrison's declaration hung in the stagnant air of the boardroom like a physical weight. Bradley stared at the polished mahogany table with hollow eyes as the catastrophic reality of his permanent disinheritance slowly crushed the last remnants of his arrogant spirit. But the elite attorney was not finished delivering the unyielding justice that Arthur had meticulously orchestrated. Harrison reached for a small silver remote resting near his pristine white ledger and pressed a single button. The massive projection screen silently descended from the ceiling once again, casting a harsh and sterile glow over the terrified faces of the predators. The lawyer announced that since the Vance family had shown such a keen interest in the financial well-being of the Pendleton estate, it was only fair to conduct a thorough review of their own spectacular liabilities. The screen illuminated with a complex and horrifying spreadsheet entirely saturated in red ink. Harrison directed his laser pointer to the final staggering figure resting at the very bottom of the document. He declared in a voice completely devoid of pity that Bradley and Chloe were currently drowning in over $800,000 of unsecured and high-interest debt. Chloe's face drained of all color as the lawyer mercilessly listed her endless stream of toxic expenditures. He highlighted the maxed-out credit cards used for exotic vacations, the fraudulent leases for luxury vehicles, and the desperate payday advances taken just to keep the illusion of wealth alive. The devastating truth was fully exposed under the fluorescent lights, proving that their supposed high society lifestyle was nothing more than a pathetic and crumbling house of cards built entirely on predatory loans. Sterling Vance aggressively puffed out his chest in a desperate attempt to distance himself from the catastrophic financial failure of his daughter and son-in-law. The fraudulent patriarch loudly proclaimed that he was deeply disgusted by their irresponsible behavior and threatened to cut them off from his own substantial fortune. Harrison offered a chilling and humorless smile before clicking the remote to advance the presentation to the next highly sensitive slide. The lawyer softly advised Sterling to save his theatrical outrage for the federal authorities who were currently preparing his indictment. The screen flashed with deeply confidential bank records and active federal surveillance logs centered entirely on Sterling boutique investment firm. Harrison systematically dismantled the fake tycoon, revealing that Sterling had been aggressively embezzling millions from his own clients to fund his wife Victoria's lavish and entirely fraudulent lifestyle. The revelation of the impending federal prison sentence acted like a spark in a room full of gasoline. The fragile and toxic alliance of the Vance family instantly exploded into a chaotic symphony of betrayal and vicious accusations. Victoria Vance turned on her husband like a rabid animal, shrieking that he had promised her generational wealth and instead delivered them directly into complete ruin. Sterling roared back at his wife, blaming her endless and greedy demands for forcing him into committing massive corporate fraud. They tore at each other viciously right in the middle of the executive boardroom, their carefully curated masks of aristocratic superiority melting away to reveal the desperate and common criminals hiding underneath. Arthur watched the internal slaughter with absolute stillness, feeling a cold and profound satisfaction as the predators completely cannibalized themselves. Amidst the screaming and the total collapse of her family empire, Chloe stood frozen in a state of absolute shock. She looked at her parents tearing each other apart and then turned her furious gaze toward the man she had married. She realized with sickening clarity that there was no $40 million rescue waiting for her, and her own safety net was headed straight to a federal penitentiary. The fake honey and practiced sweetness vanished entirely from her voice, replaced by a low and reptilian hiss of pure hatred. Chloe stalked toward Bradley and aggressively verbally assaulted him, screaming that he was a useless fraud and a pathetic failure who could not even manage to inherit his own family fortune correctly. She blamed him entirely for her current destitute reality, refusing to accept even a single fraction of accountability for her own monstrous greed. Bradley could not formulate a single word of defense as the woman he had sacrificed his soul to please verbally annihilated him in front of his parents. He looked up at Chloe with tears of sheer panic welling in his eyes, desperately hoping for a single ounce of the love she had so easily faked for years. Instead of offering comfort, Chloe reached for her left hand and aggressively yanked the massive diamond engagement ring off her finger. The ring that Bradley had secretly taken a predatory loan to purchase was now just another worthless symbol of his total ruin. She drew her arm back and hurled the heavy piece of jewelry directly at his face with all the violent fury she could muster. The ring struck Bradley sharply on the cheek before clattering loudly onto the polished floor, accompanied by Chloe's final and deafening scream that she was demanding an immediate and absolute divorce. Eleanor sat quietly beside her husband and watched the spectacular destruction of the marriage that had caused her so much unimaginable pain. She did not feel a single ounce of sympathy for the weeping man sitting across the table because she finally recognized that his suffering was entirely self-inflicted. Arthur reached over and gently intertwined his fingers with hers, offering a silent reassurance that the hardest part of their brutal ordeal was finally coming to an end. The majestic executive boardroom that was supposed to host the quiet surrender of an elderly couple had been masterfully transformed into a slaughterhouse for the greedy and the corrupt. The Vance family had walked in as arrogant conquerors, but they were now broken and destitute criminals screaming over the ashes of their fake empire. The absolute financial annihilation was complete, and the only thing left to do was sweep away the remaining garbage. The chaotic screaming of the Vance family was abruptly silenced when Harrison slammed his open palm against the polished mahogany table. The sharp sound echoed like a gunshot through the executive boardroom, instantly freezing the arrogant predators in their tracks. The elite attorney adjusted his suit jacket and stated in a voice completely devoid of patience that his office was not a playground for common criminals to air their petty grievances. He instructed them to sit down and remain absolutely quiet because the legal proceedings of the Pendleton Family Trust were not yet concluded. Sterling and Victoria Vance slumped back into their leather chairs with the defeated posture of cornered animals. Chloe stood frozen by the window with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, refusing to even look at the weeping man she had just violently discarded. Harrison reached for the intercom button on his console and calmly requested that his assistant send a final guest into the room. The heavy wooden door at the far end of the boardroom slowly opened and a young woman stepped hesitantly into the tense atmosphere. It was Maya, Arthur's beloved niece, wearing a set of faded blue medical scrubs and carrying a battered canvas tote bag. She was a dedicated nurse who had spent countless nights sitting by Eleanor's bedside during her recent bout of pneumonia, asking for absolutely nothing in return. Maya possessed a quiet and gentle strength that stood in stark contrast to the aggressive and manufactured glamour of the Vance family. Eleanor immediately offered the young woman a warm and genuine smile, silently thanking her for arriving exactly on time. Bradley wiped his tear-stained face and stared at his cousin in utter disbelief, his voice cracking as he demanded to know why a lowly hospital worker was interrupting a private financial meeting. Harrison did not tolerate the blatant disrespect and immediately cut Bradley off with a voice as sharp as a scalpel. The attorney explained that the meeting was no longer a private matter for Bradley because he had just been legally erased from the family records. Harrison officially introduced Maya to the stunned room as the designated contingent beneficiary of the Pendleton Family Trust. He clarified that Arthur had established a secondary line of succession decades ago just in case his primary heir proved to be a catastrophic failure. The moment Bradley signed the fraudulent confession and triggered the lethal poison pill, the entire estate automatically bypassed him. Harrison looked directly at the trembling son and announced that as of this exact minute, Maya was the sole legal owner of the $40 million fortune and the absolute master of the suburban wooden house. Bradley let out a hollow and broken laugh that sounded completely disconnected from reality. He shook his head frantically, pointing a shaking finger at Maya and screaming that it was a sick joke to give a massive financial empire to a part-time nurse. Maya did not shrink back from his desperate anger. Instead, she walked confidently toward the center of the massive boardroom table. She looked at the pathetic man who had plotted to throw his own parents into a miserable facility and felt absolutely no pity for his current ruin. Maya reached into her canvas tote bag and pulled out a single crisp sheet of paper, placing it deliberately on the polished wood right in front of Bradley. She spoke with a calm and unwavering authority, stating that the paper was a formal and legally binding eviction notice effective immediately. The young nurse informed Bradley and Chloe that they were no longer future owners of the suburban house, but rather unwanted trespassers occupying her personal property. Maya declared that they had exactly 24 hours to pack their belongings and completely vacate the premises. She warned them that the locks would be permanently changed at precisely 3 o'clock the following afternoon. If any of their expensive designer clothing, luxury furniture, or personal items remained inside the house after the deadline, they would be immediately dragged to the curb and thrown directly into the garbage. Chloe opened her mouth to shriek a protest about her valuable possessions, but Harrison swiftly reminded her that the federal authorities were already highly interested in their location. The threat of immediate arrest instantly extinguished any remaining fight the fraudulent woman had left in her. Sterling Vance realized that there was absolutely no money to be stolen and no leverage left to exploit in this room. The disgraced patriarch grabbed his terrified wife by the arm and practically dragged her toward the exit, desperate to flee before the federal agents arrived to place him in handcuffs. Chloe did not waste a single second mourning the total destruction of her marriage. She grabbed her expensive handbag and marched out the door right behind her criminal parents, stepping carelessly over the discarded diamond engagement ring still resting on the floor. The heavy glass doors clicked shut behind them, sealing their fate and banishing them from the penthouse forever. The loud and arrogant vultures had completely vanished, leaving Bradley entirely alone in the massive boardroom to face the terrifying consequences of his own monumental betrayal. Bradley knelt on the thick carpet of the executive boardroom. The sound of the heavy glass doors clicking shut behind his fleeing wife and her criminal parents echoed in the massive space. He was utterly and completely alone, stripped of his fraudulent marriage, his unearned house, and the $40 million inheritance he had so desperately craved. The crushing weight of his $800,000 debt finally settled onto his shoulders, suffocating him with the terrifying reality of impending prison time. He looked up at Arthur and Eleanor with eyes red and swollen from panic, tears streaming freely down his pale face. He crawled forward on his knees, gripping the edge of the mahogany table, and begged his parents for mercy in a voice choked with pathetic desperation. Eleanor rose from her leather chair and walked slowly toward the broken man weeping on the floor. She looked down at the son she had nurtured and loved, her face a mask of profound sorrow and unyielding disappointment. She raised her hand and struck Bradley across the cheek with a sharp, resounding slap that punished him for the terror and humiliation he had forced upon them. Bradley did not flinch or protest, simply bowing his head and accepting the physical sting as a fraction of what he deserved. Then Eleanor let out a shuddering sob, falling to her knees beside him and wrapping her arms tightly around his shaking shoulders. She wept bitterly into his expensive suit, proving that a mother love could endure even the most devastating betrayals, but it could no longer protect him from the consequences. Arthur watched the heartbreaking embrace for a long moment before stepping forward to deliver the final verdict. He told his son in a voice completely devoid of warmth that there were only 2 paths left to take. The first path involved Harrison immediately forwarding the signed confession of elder fraud to the district attorney, guaranteeing Bradley a lengthy sentence in a federal penitentiary. The second path required absolute submission to a highly specific and grueling set of conditions designed to break his arrogant spirit. Bradley nodded frantically against his mother's shoulder, weeping that he would do absolutely anything to avoid going to prison and to somehow make things right. Arthur looked down at the pathetic creature at his feet and calmly outlined the iron penance that would define the rest of his life. Arthur dictated that Bradley must immediately finalize his divorce from Chloe, waiving all rights to any shared assets or future claims. Furthermore, he was ordered to return to the humble suburban house, not as a beloved son, but as a heavily indebted tenant. Bradley would be forced to live in the exact same dark basement room he had callously planned to banish his parents into just 24 hours ago. He would have to secure a grueling blue-collar job and spend every evening acting as the live-in handyman for Maya, the new legal owner of the property. Every single dollar he earned through physical labor would go towards slowly chipping away at his massive debt. Bradley stared at the floor, absorbing the total humiliation of his new reality, and offered a slow, defeated nod of absolute acceptance. 6 months later, the suburban wooden house radiated a profound sense of peace and genuine warmth that it had not known in years. Maya and Eleanor were sitting on the front porch swing, laughing softly over a cup of afternoon tea while the autumn leaves fell gently around them. Arthur sat in his favorite rocking chair, watching the driveway where Bradley was covered in dark grease and engine oil. The once arrogant marketing director was wrestling with the rusted engine of an old lawnmower, his hands calloused and permanently stained from months of hard labor. Bradley wiped the sweat from his forehead, successfully starting the engine with a loud roar, and walked over to hand his father a crumpled envelope containing his first payment of $100. Arthur accepted the meager sum, knowing it would take centuries to repay the debt, but he finally saw a real man being forged from the ashes of a greedy boy. This story serves as a powerful reminder that true wealth is never measured by designer labels, luxury cars, or the desperate approval of high society. Real value is found in the integrity of your character, the honesty of your labor, and the unwavering respect you show to the people who raised you. Greed and vanity create a fragile house of cards that will inevitably collapse under the heavy weight of truth and justice. Never underestimate the quiet strength of those who live simply, because their silent observation often holds the power to completely dismantle arrogance. We must remember that family is built on a solid foundation of mutual respect, gratitude, and unconditional love, rather than entitlement and exploitation. How did this story make you feel, and what lessons have you drawn from Arthur and his methodical pursuit of justice? Please share your thoughts and relate this situation to your own real-life experiences in the comments below, because we truly want to hear the emotions speaking from deep within your heart. If you found value in this story, please hit the like button, share this video with your loved ones, and subscribe to our channel to listen to more compelling and emotional stories every single day. We sincerely wish everyone watching this video a life filled with excellent health, daily joy, and profound peace of mind. Thank you so much for your time, goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.